He was not a warrior. He was not brave. He was not charismatic. He never fired a heroic shot. He never led men from the front. And yet, no single man did more to turn murder into routine. No single man built a system where killing became paperwork. No single man proved that evil does not need rage, only obedience. This is not the story of a battlefield monster. This is the story of a clerk who learned how to erase human beings. This is the story of Heinrich Himmler. If this story resonates with you, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps keep these long-form, carefully researched stories going. Now on back to the story. Before Heinrich Himmler became the architect of terror, he was something far less imposing. Before Heinrich Himmler became the face of terror, before uniforms, before rituals, before mass graves and crematoria, he was simply a boy who felt small, not metaphorically, physically, emotionally, existentially. He was born in 1900 into a conservative, Catholic, middle-class German family. Respectable, disciplined, unremarkable. His father was a strict schoolmaster, a man who believed in rules, structure, and obedience above affection. Himmler grew up surrounded by expectations he could not meet. He was sickly, weak-chested, prone to stomach problems and fevers. He struggled in sports. He failed at the physical tests other boys passed easily. In a culture that worshipped strength, masculinity, and military virtue, Heinrich Himmler learned early that he did not belong, and that wound never healed. World War I came at the perfect time for boys who wanted to prove themselves. Himmler wanted desperately to fight. He idolized soldiers. He collected military statistics. He memorized ranks, units, and decorations. He imagined himself transformed by uniform and discipline into something powerful. But the war didn't want him. Medical exams rejected him repeatedly. Too weak, too frail, not suitable. While other young men marched to the front and returned scarred, or not at all, Himmler stayed behind, watching, resenting, taking notes. This wasn't just disappointment, it was humiliation. And humiliation, when combined with obsession, ferments into something dangerous. Himmler kept diaries, not poetic ones, not emotional confessions. Lists, schedules, observations, what he ate and how he slept, how many hours he worked, what he believed a proper man should be. Even as a teenager, his writing lacked warmth. There was no joy, no curiosity, no wonder, only measurement. He didn't want freedom, he wanted order, because order promised safety, and safety promised power. Germany lost the war. The Kaiser fled. The empire collapsed. The old certainties evaporated. For many, this chaos was terrifying. For Himmler, it was intolerable. Democracy felt weak. Pluralism felt noisy. Compromise felt humiliating. He wanted a world where everyone knew their place. Every action had rules. Every deviation was punished. Every question had a single correct answer. This was not ideology yet. It was psychology. Himmler gravitated toward extremist groups not because they were violent, but because they were clear. They offered simple explanations, clear enemies, absolute hierarchies, rituals that replaced meaning. Most people joined movements for belonging. Himmler joined them for structure. He didn't want to feel strong. He wanted to be protected by systems. And systems, once internalized, can do terrible things without emotion. Himmler was not naturally anti-Semitic in his youth, but anti-Semitism gave him something priceless, a way to explain his own inadequacy. If the world was broken because of others, then his failures were not personal. They were historical. Victimhood became fuel, resentment became righteousness, and righteousness, once institutionalized, becomes cruelty without guilt. Unlike charismatic figures, Himmler did not inspire crowds. He bored them. He spoke stiffly. He lacked humor. He lacked magnetism. But what he possessed was far more dangerous. Patience, obsession with detail, absolute loyalty upward, ruthlessness downward. He didn't challenge authority. He embedded himself inside it. He didn't seek glory. He sought permanence. When Himmler entered the SS, it was insignificant. A small guard unit, poorly equipped, politically marginal. But Himmler didn't see a militia. He saw a priesthood. He transformed it into a racial order, a moral caste, a self-policing elite. a belief system disguised as an organization. Uniforms were sacred garments. Rituals replaced faith. Obedience replaced conscience. This wasn't fanaticism, it was bureaucracy infused with mythology. And that combination is lethal. Himmler never questioned orders, but more importantly, he learned how to anticipate them. He learned how to create systems that remove choice, paperwork, chains of command, standard procedures, no screaming, no rage, no visible hatred, just process. And process does not feel evil to those who run it. Long before camps, long before gas chambers, long before mass murder, Himmler had already made one fatal decision. He would never rely on personal judgment, only rules, only systems, only obedience, because if no one chooses, no one feels guilty. By the early 1930s, Heinrich Himmler was no longer a weak boy, but he wasn't strong either. He had become something far worse, a man who believed morality could be replaced by administration, and once that belief takes root, the aftermath is inevitable. Heinrich Himmler did not want chaos defeated by courage. He wanted chaos eliminated by procedure. That distinction matters, because courage can hesitate. Procedure does not. Power is visible, control is quiet. Power demands attention. Control removes alternatives. Himmler was never interested in being admired. Admiration is unstable. He wanted something far more reliable in compliance. Not loyalty based on emotion, not devotion based on belief, but obedience so routine that no one remembered choosing it. Himmler observed something early that others missed. People resist when they feel responsible. People obey when responsibility is fragmented. So he designed a world where no one made the full decision, no one saw the full consequence, no one felt the full weight. A world where killing was not an act, it was a sequence. Under Himmler, the SS stopped behaving like soldiers. Soldiers improvise, soldiers react, soldiers panic. Himmler hated all three. He wanted men who followed instructions, even when those instructions violated instinct. Especially then, the SS was reorganized not around bravery, but around reliability. Not who was strongest, not who was smartest, but who was most predictable. Contrary to myth, the most important test for SS recruits was not brutality, it was conformity. Could they follow rules without questioning, repeat ideology without understanding, perform tasks without emotional interference, accept contradictions without protest? Anyone can be cruel, but only certain men can be cruel methodically. Those were Himmler's men. Himmler stripped religion from the USSR and replaced it with ritual, not to inspire belief, but to remove doubt, ceremonies, symbols, oaths. They created a sense of inevitability. When an action feels ceremonial, it feels sanctioned. When it feels sanctioned, it feels correct. And when it feels correct, no one asks why. Himmler's greatest innovation was not violence, it was depersonalization. He broke actions into compartments. One man identifies, another transports, another guards, another records, another disposes. Each task is small. Each task is procedural. Each task feels incomplete. No one kills, the system kills. And systems do not feel remorse. Himmler rewrote ethics as logistics. Words mattered. Execution became special treatment. Murder became processing. Bodies became units. Language was not softened to deceive victims. It was softened to protect perpetrators. Because words shape perception, and perception shapes conscience, or dissolves it. Contrary to expectation, Himmler discouraged emotional hatred. Hatred burns hot. Hatred exhausts. Hatred leads to mistakes. He wanted men who could kill calmly, without rage and without pleasure, without reflection. Hatred still involves the other as human. Himmler wanted the other erased entirely. Himmler was not screaming. He was not foaming. He was not theatrical. He was administrative. He spoke in numbers, in efficiency, in reports. He believed he was solving problems. And the most dangerous people in history are those who believe they are solving problems. Inside the SS, obedience was not a tool. It was a moral good. Disobedience was framed not as disagreement, but as weakness. Doubt was not intellectual. It was pathological. If you hesitated, it meant something was wrong with you. This reversed moral gravity. The system became righteous. The individual became suspect. Himmler rarely threatened. He structured environments so that refusal felt abnormal, compliance felt natural, alternatives seemed invisible. When everyone around you complies, non-compliance feels like rebellion, and rebellion feels dangerous. So people complied, not because they were ordered, but because it felt expected. Fanatics burn out, they overreach, they expose themselves. Himmler endured. He built slow, he built quiet, he built systems that survived personalities. That is why, even when leaders argued, the machine kept running. And when the machine runs long enough, atrocity becomes routine. Himmler convinced himself of something crucial, that he was not cruel, that he was necessary, that history demanded hardness, that someone had to do the unpleasant work, so others could live peacefully. This self-image allowed him to sleep, and men who sleep easily after horror are capable of anything. By the late 1930s, Himmler was no longer the weak boy, but he was also no longer a man. He had become a function, an interface between ideology and implementation. He didn't pull triggers. He authorized flows. He didn't witness deaths. He measured outcomes. And that is how obedience became architecture. At this stage, something irreversible happened. The system no longer needed belief. It only needed continuation. Even if Himmler vanished, the machine would still work. And when a system no longer requires conviction, it becomes unstoppable. By the time the war began, the system no longer asked why. It only asked how fast and how many. At first there were reactions. Men vomited, hands shook, sleep vanished. Himmler noticed this and considered it a flaw, not a moral one, a technical one, because emotion slowed efficiency. And inefficiency, in Himmler's mind, was unacceptable. Mass murder had an unexpected complication. Human beings were not designed to kill at scale, not emotionally, not psychologically, not sustainably. Shootings required proximity. Proximity created memory. Memory created collapse. Himmler didn't see this as tragedy. He saw it as a design flaw. And every flaw, to him, demanded redesign. Distance removes empathy. So Himmler introduced it. Victims became silhouettes, then figures, then numbers. Orders came on paper, not voice. Results were reported statistically, not visually. The fewer faces seen, the fewer consciences activated. Distance wasn't cruelty, it was insulation. No man would do everything. Each would do one thing. One man guarded a gate. One man loaded a train. One man signed a form. One man kept records. No one experienced the full event. This fragmented responsibility until it felt abstract. No guilt attaches to fragments, only to wholes. Himmler refined vocabulary with surgical precision. Words were tools. Tools reshaped perception. Murder became processing. Death became outcome. Bodies became units. Language did not hide reality from victims. It hid reality from perpetrators. If you do not name a thing truthfully, you do not experience it fully. Once actions repeat, they normalize. Routine anesthetizes conscience. What shocks once becomes background noise the 10th time. What horrifies today becomes paperwork tomorrow. Himmler understood repetition was more powerful than ideology. Beliefs can weaken. Habits rarely do. Chaos suggests humanity. Screaming, panic, resistance. Order erases individuality. Lines and schedules, procedures. Even death had timetables, and timetables feel civilized. That illusion was essential, because civilization excuses brutality, better than savagery ever could. Himmler did not want sadists. Sadists enjoy suffering. Enjoyment implies emotion. Emotion implies instability. He wanted men who felt nothing, men who performed tasks, men who went home, ate dinner, slept, men who believed they were normal, and most of them were. That is the horror. At a certain point, reports became smoother, fewer complaints, fewer breakdowns, fewer questions. The system ran efficiently, predictably. Himmler felt pride, not in death, in optimization. This is when the machine truly existed, when it no longer depended on conviction, only continuation. After the war, the world searched for monsters. They expected screaming zealots, bloodthirsty fanatics. Himmler did not fit. He was dull, pedantic, meticulous, which made him more dangerous. Because monsters feel rare, bureaucrats feel familiar, and familiarity lowers vigilance. Himmler created what psychologists later struggled to name, a space where actions occurred without emotional registration. Men were not cruel, they were absent. Absent from empathy, absent from reflection, absent from responsibility. This was not rage, it was emptiness. And emptiness scales infinitely. They didn't see themselves as villains, they saw themselves as workers, doing their jobs, following rules, protecting order. That self-image preserved sanity, and sanity preserved productivity. Himmler ensured both. Once killing became routine, stopping felt disruptive. Stopping felt irresponsible. Stopping felt dangerous. Continuing felt safe. And when safety aligns with atrocity, atrocity accelerates. Himmler believed he had eliminated chaos. But what he truly eliminated was feeling. And when feeling disappears, there is no internal break, only momentum. By now, the system did not need ideology. It did not need hatred. It did not need passion. It only needed time. And time was exactly what it had. Every system looks powerful until it stops working. And when it does, what remains is not ideology. It is character. By late 1944, something changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, quietly. Orders took longer. Reports became vague. Numbers stopped adding up. The machine still ran, but unevenly, and Heinrich Himmler felt it. For the first time in years, control slipped. Not because of morality, not because of doubt, but because reality intruded. Himmler had built obedience as a virtue. But virtue, he discovered, has an expiration date. When the Reich advanced, obedience felt righteous. When it stalled, obedience felt heavy. When it retreated, obedience felt dangerous. Men still followed orders, but they watched exits. They still saluted, but their eyes calculated. Loyalty was not gone. It was hedging. For years, Himmler told himself a story, that he was indispensable, that the system needed him, that his discipline was the glue holding everything together. Collapse revealed the truth. The system did not love him, it tolerated him, and tolerance vanishes under pressure. Publicly, Himmler remained calm. Privately, he unraveled. Sleep vanished, health deteriorated, decision-making slowed. The man who demanded order could no longer impose it, because order requires confidence, and confidence requires belief. His belief had cracked. As defeat became inevitable, Himmler did something unthinkable. He tried to negotiate, not openly, not bravely, secretly. Quiet channels, indirect messages, plausible deniability. The architect of loyalty sought escape. This was not strategy, it was fear. For years, Himmler demanded absolute obedience. No exceptions, no alternatives, no mercy. Now faced with consequences, he searched for flexibility. The hypocrisy was total, and everyone saw it. Power structures sense hesitation instantly. Once rumors spread that Himmler was hedging, authority evaporated. Orders were questioned, compliance slowed, fear shifted direction, not away from enemies, toward him. Himmler had never stood in a trench, never charged under fire, never risked his life personally. Now danger approached, and he did not meet it with resolve. He retreated into procedure. Paperwork, excuses, delegation. But procedure does not stop collapse. It only documents it. As chaos closed in, Himmler did not rush to defend. He moved away. From responsibility, from consequence, from the wreckage he helped create. Distance, his favorite tool, became his refuge. The same distance that once insulated conscience, now insulated survival. In the final months, Himmler discovered a truth he had avoided. Loyalty enforced by fear does not survive fear. When the machine could no longer protect its operators, they looked elsewhere. Some fled, some defected, some disappeared. No oaths mattered, only survival. There was no dramatic stand, no final command. No acceptance of responsibility, only confusion. The man who once controlled millions could not control his own fate, and the system he built offered him no mercy. Himmler misunderstood loyalty. He believed it could be engineered. It cannot. Loyalty is not a function. It is a relationship. And he had replaced relationships with procedures. When procedures failed, nothing remained. In his own mind, Himmler still saw himself as faithful. Faithful to order, faithful to structure, faithful to the idea of obedience, but loyalty to systems is not loyalty to people. And history judges outcomes, not intentions. By the end, Himmler was alone, not physically, existentially. The machine ran without meaning. The ideology collapsed without defense. The architect stood without shelter. Everything he built had no place for him. The myth was gone. What remained was not a monster, not a mastermind, but a functionary who mistook control for strength. And when control vanished, so did he. When the war ended, the world wanted monsters. It wanted horns. It wanted madness. It wanted rage carved into faces. What it found instead was paperwork. Heinrich Himmler did not die in a blaze of ideology. There was no final speech, no declaration of belief, no refusal to surrender. There was only flight, false papers, a borrowed identity, a man trying to disappear into the chaos he once commanded. The architect of total control, reduced to a fugitive with a fake name. This was not tragedy, it was exposure. When Himmler was captured, something unsettling happened. There was no defiance, no theatrical hatred, no ideological fire, only fear. A man worried about his own fate, the same man who had designed a world where millions never had that luxury. The contrast was unbearable. Himmler chose poison, quick, private, controlled. Even in death, he avoided responsibility. He did not testify. He did not explain. He did not confront consequence. He exited. And in doing so, revealed his final truth. He was never willing to endure the world he had built for others. History often fixates on how villains die. That misses the point. Himmler's danger was never in his death. It was in his normality. He did not invent hatred. He organized it. He did not unleash chaos. He regulated it. He did not embody evil. He administered it. After the war, investigators searched for explanations. Psychological profiles, pathologies, madness. They hoped to find something abnormal. They failed. What they found instead was deeply uncomfortable. A man who loved routine. A man obsessed with order. A man who believed rules mattered more than people. A man who saw morality as inefficient. There was no single moment of madness, only accumulation. Evil, in Himmler's case, did not roar. It whispered. It filled forms. It scheduled trains. It optimized processes. It wore glasses. It kept diaries. It worried about efficiency. This was not the evil of passion. It was the evil of function. And that kind is endless. Himmler did not require a unique personality. He required a system that rewarded obedience over judgment, the efficiency over empathy, loyalty over responsibility. Given those conditions, someone like him will always emerge, not because they crave destruction, but because they crave order. We tell ourselves, I would have resisted. I would have refused. I would have known better. Himmler's life challenges that comfort because he did not begin as a monster. He began as a man who wanted clarity. And clarity, when detached from humanity, becomes lethal. Himmler died, but the logic he built did not. Bureaucratic cruelty, moral outsourcing, distance from consequence. These did not end in 1945. They reappear wherever systems grow large enough to obscure responsibility, where no one feels fully accountable, where everyone is just doing their job. The aftermath is not ruins. It is precedent. It is the proof that you do not need hatred to destroy lives. You do not need rage to commit atrocities. You only need structure without conscience, and people willing to obey it. Himmler's story does not end with his death. It ends with a question. One history keeps asking again and again. What happens when morality is replaced by procedure? What happens when responsibility is diluted? What happens when human beings become inputs? The answer is not theoretical. It has already happened. This was not the story of a monster. It was the story of a system so efficient, it no longer needed monsters at all. Just ordinary people doing ordinary tasks without ever stopping to feel. If this story made you uncomfortable, that's intentional. Tell us in the comments, what part was hardest to sit with? Because the most unsettling part of this story did not end with his death. It began when the world tried to return to normal. When Heinrich Himmler died, the world exhaled. But what followed was not relief. It was something far more dangerous: normalization. There was no moment when the war cleanly became history, no single morning where the machinery of destruction suddenly ceased to exist. Instead, there was continuity. Buildings still stood, offices still had desks, folders still contained names. In the weeks after Germany's surrender, amid bombed streets and displaced populations, an unexpected rhythm returned. Paperwork resumed. Typewriters clicked again. Files were stacked and labeled. Administrative routines quietly restarted. The same structures that had once organized terror were not erased. They were repurposed. The visible faces of the regime were gone. Hitler was dead. Goebbels was dead. Himmler was dead. But behind those faces had always been layers: planners, clerks, coordinators, logisticians. Most of them survived the collapse. They were not dragged through the streets. They were not hunted relentlessly. Many were questioned. Few were truly dismantled, because dismantling them required something the post-war world struggled to do: to confront systems, not symbols. The Allied powers had prepared to defeat an army. They had not prepared to undo an administrative machine. They expected visible villains. They found offices. They expected fanatics. They found men who spoke calmly, politely, and with professional detachment. Men who explained their roles carefully. I handled transportation. I processed documents. I reported figures. Each statement sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they described industrialized death. Trials depend on clarity, clear perpetrators, clear intent, clear actions. Himmler's system had been designed to avoid exactly that. Responsibility had been divided into fragments so small that no single person appeared to hold it. Who was responsible? The man who drafted the order? The man who approved it? The man who typed it? The man who forwarded it? The man who implemented it? Each could point elsewhere, and many did. Responsibility did not disappear. It dissolved. Even after the regime collapsed, the language endured. Former officials struggled to speak plainly. They used the same euphemisms: measures, procedures, outcomes. This was not deception. It was habit. For years, they had trained themselves not to name reality directly. And habits, once internalized, do not dissolve with a signature on a surrender document. Psychologists expected remorse. They expected trauma. They expected visible guilt. Often, they found none. Not denial, absence. Many former administrators displayed no emotional response to their own past actions, not because they were hardened, but because they had never emotionally processed those actions in the first place. The system had removed the need. As the 1950s unfolded, society rebuilt. Factories reopened. Governments reformed. Families tried to forget. Some of the same men who had once operated Himmler's bureaucracy now worked quietly in civilian life. They became managers, consultants, administrators. They adapted easily because the skills that made them effective under the regime were the same skills valued afterward: efficiency, reliability, silence. They did not stand out. They blended in. This continuity unsettled those who noticed it, because it suggested something deeply disturbing. Atrocity had not required monstrous individuals. It had required ordinary people placed inside systems that rewarded compliance and discouraged reflection. That realization was dangerous. It implied the threat was not gone, only dormant. This is not a German story. It is a system story. And systems do not belong to one country. They exist wherever people believe responsibility can be deferred, where decisions are broken into steps so small that no one feels accountable, where following procedure feels safer than questioning purpose. It survives wherever harm is explained as process, where actions are divided until no one sees the whole, where people are told they are not cruel, only compliant, where moral discomfort is treated as inefficiency, not because people are evil, but because systems make it easier not to feel. No one inside Himmler's machinery believed they were making history. They believed they were doing something necessary. Necessary for stability. Necessary for order. Necessary for survival. That belief, more than ideology, made everything possible. Because necessity justifies actions that conscience alone would reject. Himmler is difficult to confront because he offers no comfortable distance. He was not visibly deranged. He was not theatrically cruel. He was methodical. He believed that structure could replace judgment. That belief did not die with him. It reappears whenever morality is outsourced to process. The ruins of the Third Reich were cleared. The trials concluded. The headlines faded. But the logic endured. The idea that responsibility can be diluted, that harm can be administered without hatred, that systems can operate without conscience. Heinrich Himmler did not prove how monsters are made. He proved how ordinary people learn to stop feeling and keep functioning anyway. Index, Part 5. Himmler is gone. What survived no longer needed a face. The war ended, but the lesson did not arrive with it. In 1945, the world wanted certainty. It wanted clean endings, clear villains, definitive closures. It wanted to believe that once the symbols were destroyed, the danger had been eliminated. What the world needed was something far more uncomfortable, an examination of how normal systems had carried out extraordinary harm. That examination never fully happened because it threatened stability. Europe was exhausted. Cities lay in ruins. Millions were displaced. Economies were paralyzed. There was no appetite for philosophical reckoning. There was only urgency. Urgency to rebuild. Urgency to restore order. Urgency to make institutions function again. And institutions do not rebuild themselves. They require people who know how systems work. It was never announced publicly. There was no formal declaration, but a quiet consensus emerged across the post-war world. Punish ideology, preserve administration, Nazism would be outlawed, symbols removed, rhetoric condemned, but the underlying machinery, that was considered reusable, necessary. Dismantling an ideology is simple. You ban it, you shame it, you outlaw it. Dismantling a system is far harder because systems do not announce themselves as evil. They present as neutral. They organize transport, manage resources, process information, maintain records. To dismantle them entirely would mean chaos. And chaos in 1945 felt like the enemy. Across ministries, corporations, and bureaucracies, a familiar pattern repeated. The man who had scheduled transports now scheduled supplies. The clerk who had processed files now processed aid requests. The administrator who understood logistics was suddenly indispensable, not because of ideology, but because of competence. Function survived where belief was condemned. This was not framed as forgiveness. It was framed as pragmatism. These people were not decision makers. They were just operators. We cannot rebuild without experienced hands. Each justification sounded reasonable. Together, they formed a dangerous precedent that technical usefulness could outweigh moral accountability. No one asked the most important question: what happens when people who learn to obey without conscience are allowed to continue operating systems of power? Not because they were evil, but because they were trained. The post-war narrative focused on belief, on hatred, on propaganda, on ideology. These were visible. They could be named and condemned. What went largely unexamined was something quieter: the normalization of responsibility transfer. The idea that moral judgment could be outsourced to procedure. That habit did not die in 1945. Never again became a promise, a vow, a moral shield. But it was framed incorrectly. It suggested that the danger was specific to one place, one time, one ideology. It implied that vigilance meant watching for the same symbols to return. History rarely repeats that conveniently. They did not learn restraint. They learned optimization. They learned how to divide responsibility more finely, distance decision makers from outcomes, use neutral language to describe harmful actions, emphasize efficiency over reflection, not as a conspiracy, as an evolution, because it did not look like cruelty. It looked like management. It looked like organization. It looked like professionals solving complex problems. And professionalism is reassuring. It feels civilized. Order feels good. It reduces uncertainty. It creates predictability. In times of instability, order feels virtuous. But order is not morality. Order is alignment. And alignment can serve anything. The lesson was not that hatred is dangerous. That was obvious. The lesson was that systems without moral interruption will always drift toward efficiency at the expense of humanity. That lesson required discomfort. And discomfort was the one thing post-war societies could not afford. It was a failure of framing. The danger was presented as emotional, anger, fanaticism, extremism. So the solution focused on emotional containment. What was ignored was structural momentum, and momentum does not stop when emotions fade. Stability was restored. Institutions resumed. Life normalized. But normalization carried a cost. It preserved habits that should have been interrogated. It rewarded people who could operate systems without asking questions. It quietly taught future generations a lesson it never meant to teach, that effectiveness matters more than reflection. Over time, the silence hardened. The war became history. The paperwork became archives. The operators became retirees. Questions became impolite. And the most unsettling realization remained unspoken, that nothing fundamental had been redesigned. Because the problem was never Germany. It was never a flag. It was never a uniform. It was the assumption that systems can be morally neutral. That assumption survived, and it travels well. The true aftermath was not reconstruction, it was normalization. The quiet decision to preserve systems, while condemning the beliefs that once animated them. That decision shaped the modern world. The most dangerous systems are not the ones born from hatred. They are the ones that inherit efficiency without inheriting responsibility. The war ended, the lesson was postponed, and postponed lessons have a way of returning when the systems grow large enough to forget why they exist. The most dangerous sentence in modern history was never shouted. It was spoken calmly. I was just doing my job. Function is comforting. It provides boundaries. It defines responsibility narrowly. It removes ambiguity. When you are functioning, you are not choosing. You are executing. And execution feels clean. Roles simplify morality. A role does not ask why, it asks how. A role does not question outcomes. It measures performance. Once inside a role, a person no longer experiences themselves as an agent. They experience themselves as a component. And components do not feel guilt. Responsibility is heavy. It requires judgment. It invites doubt. It demands ownership of consequence. Function dissolves that weight. Responsibility becomes distributed, fragmented, diluted. No single person feels accountable because no single person feels complete. After 1945, the world became obsessed with systems. Governments expanded. Corporations grew. Bureaucracies multiplied. Complexity was framed as progress, and complexity requires specialization. Specialization creates distance. Distance creates comfort. Inside a functioning system, no one feels malicious. They feel necessary. They feel busy. They feel useful. They feel productive. Harm does not feel like harm when it arrives labeled as output. Function has its own vocabulary: process, protocol, compliance, throughput, optimization. These words are emotionally sterile. They do not describe people. They describe movement. And movement feels morally neutral. Within functional systems, morality feels inefficient. It slows decision-making. It introduces friction. It complicates outcomes. So it is reframed, not as wrong, but as impractical. Efficiency feels ethical. It looks responsible. It looks professional. It looks modern. But efficiency answers only one question: how quickly can something be done? It never asks, should it be done at all? Obedience is predictable. Predictability is efficient. Efficiency is rewarded. So systems select for people who do not resist, not because resistance is immoral, but because it is disruptive. Over time, systems evolve, not by intention, by preference. They retain people who follow instructions precisely, avoid moral ambiguity, prioritize completion over reflection, do not personalize outcomes. Others do not rise and they stall, they exit. This does not happen suddenly, it happens incrementally. A task here, a compromise there, a justification repeated often enough to feel true. Eventually, discomfort fades, not because the action improves, but because the feeling dulls. Function offers a powerful illusion. I did not decide this. I did not create the policy. I did not control the outcome. All statements can be true and still irrelevant because participation matters, even when intention does not. It ends conversation. It shuts down inquiry. It reframes responsibility as misplaced. After all, how can you blame a function? No ideology has protected wrongdoing more effectively than professional detachment. It allows people to see themselves as neutral while participating in harm. And neutrality feels virtuous. At a certain point, people stop saying, I do this. They begin saying, this is what I am. Identity fuses with role. Questioning the role feels like a personal attack, and defense becomes automatic. This system does not require hatred. It does not require belief. It does not require cruelty. It requires only continuation. And continuation is easy when nothing feels personal. Function reduces anxiety. It gives people certainty. It tells them where they belong. That comfort is intoxicating because it removes the burden of judgment. But there is a cost. It is not immediate. It is cumulative. When millions of small functions operate without reflection, outcomes grow beyond intention, and no one feels responsible. This is not about history. It is about architecture. The same structure appears wherever. Roles are rigid. Outcomes are abstract. Responsibility is diffuse. Efficiency is sacred. Different contexts, same mechanism. Every system asks, how do we do this better? Almost none ask, like, what are we becoming by doing this at all? The most dangerous systems do not feel dangerous from the inside. They feel orderly. They feel justified. They feel normal. And that is precisely why they endure. The most frightening systems are not the ones controlled by a single will. They are the ones where no will can be clearly found at all. Responsibility does not vanish suddenly. It thins, it spreads. It is divided into tasks so small that no one recognizes it as responsibility anymore. Each person holds a piece. No one holds the whole. And without a whole, there is no one left to answer for it. Systems do not defend themselves with lies. They defend themselves with complexity. When something goes wrong, there is always another layer, another department, another protocol, another approval chain. By the time blame reaches the top, it no longer resembles a human decision. It resembles a process failure. At some point, harm is transformed, not erased, reframed. It becomes an unintended consequence, a miscommunication, a statistical outlier, a procedural breakdown. Never a choice, never a decision, never a person. Guilt requires ownership. Ownership requires clarity. Clarity requires simplicity. But modern systems are built to avoid simplicity. They grow complex not just for efficiency, but for insulation. The more layers exist, the safer everyone feels. When accountability approaches, systems retreat to their strongest defense. It had to be done. Necessary for stability, necessary for security, necessary for progress. Necessity is powerful. Its silence is moral language. Because arguing against necessity sounds irresponsible. This is the paradox. Mass participation creates moral invisibility. If everyone contributed, who exactly is to blame? Responsibility diffuses until it evaporates. Not because people deny it, but because no one can locate it anymore. History often tries to fix this, with trials, with commissions, with reports. But systems built to avoid responsibility also avoid clear evidence of it. They leave paperwork, not intention. And paperwork rarely convicts. It assumes a singular actor. But the most destructive outcomes are rarely caused by one person. They emerge from alignment, from compliance, from repetition. They are produced, not perpetrated. Once harm becomes routine, it feels normal. And normal does not trigger alarm. People adapt. They adjust expectations. They recalibrate conscience. What once felt intolerable becomes background noise. Time dulls outrage, memory fades, urgency dissolves. Eventually, the question shifts from, how did this happen? To why are we still talking about it? And that is when systems win. The most persistent lie is this, that such things belong to the past. as if mechanisms expire, as if structures forget, as if complexity makes us wiser. History suggests otherwise, because the conditions remain attractive: efficiency, order, predictability, distance from consequence. These are seductive. They promise safety. They promise control. They promise relief from moral uncertainty. At a certain scale, responsibility becomes abstract, optional, symbolic. People speak of values while measuring outputs. They condemn outcomes while preserving processes. They mourn consequences while protecting systems. When no one feels responsible, nothing intervenes. Not conscience, not fear, not reflection. Only momentum remains. And momentum does not self-correct because it denies us a villain. It denies us closure. It denies us the comfort of distance. It suggests the danger is not out there. It is structural. It is familiar. It is boring. This story does not ask, what would you have done then? That question is too easy. It asks, what do you accept now? Because it feels normal. Where do you defer judgment? Where do you trust process over conscience? Where do you stop asking questions? Because the system says it has already answered them. They do not fear outrage. They fear scrutiny, not anger, but attention, sustained attention, the kind that asks who benefits, who decides, who absorbs the harm, and refuses to accept procedural answers. Responsibility returns only when individuals reclaim it, not loudly, not heroically, quietly, by refusing to hide behind function, by naming outcomes honestly, by accepting discomfort. This was never only the story of one man, or one regime, or one era. It is the story of what happens when systems become more important than people, when function replaces judgment, when no one feels responsible. The most dangerous systems are not the ones that demand loyalty. They are the ones that dissolve it until no one feels obligated to anyone at all. And by then, nothing needs to be ordered. Everything simply continues.